Okay, so following on from last week's video where I started to look at the 12-inch line from character options based on the new series of Doctor Who, in this video I'm going to take a closer look at what I tend to think of as the Series 2 monsters. Now, it's not all of the monsters because of course you will notice that the Cybermen are missing from this lineup, but don't worry, I'll be getting to them in another video. In this video though, I'll be focusing on the Clockwork Man, Novice Haim and the Ood. Of the three, I have to say, I think Novice Haim is probably the weakest of the three in terms of character choice or selection for this 12-inch line. There are a number of great villains in that second series. I certainly think Clockwork Man and Ood are definitely standouts of Series 2. Novice Haim, I think, has an interesting visual quality, but probably isn't one of the more memorable characters of that season, in my opinion. Now, the packaging for the figure is pretty consistent with what we'd seen already in the previous video. It has the Doctor Who logo, it has that colouring and branding all around it, that sort of fiery yellow and orange, which looks really attractive and very colourful on the shelf. We have that little image of the character itself from the show in the bottom left hand corner, which is great, and of course we have that wonderful window display. Now, the actual inlay for this figure is the same as we saw with Martha. It is that New Earth backdrop, which is pretty cool. The boxes are trapezoid in shape, meaning they tend to curve round the front there, so we can see if we put these boxes all next to each other on the shelf, we can just about make out the character side profile. So these look quite attractive when stacking them next to each other. I think it looks pretty good. Meanwhile, on the reverse, we have an image of the character, again that same production shot we see in the front of the packaging. We have a little bit of bio, not a lot of text there, and then we have that wonderful image of the TARDIS flying through the vortex at the very bottom of the packaging. So this is very colourful, very displayable, and pretty fun. Now then, for a figure that I was initially hesitant about, and I'm not wild about this character, I have to say that the figure definitely surpasses expectations, and I think they've done a really nice job with this toy all in all. For starters, the head sculpt is excellent, and this is something that'd be pretty consistent in this line. The sculpts are, generally speaking, very good for this scale and for this price point on the market at the time. It's pretty solid stuff, and I can't think of a single example where they drop the ball, to be honest. This is a really good line for likenesses. Now, the costume itself is a little bland and a bit dull. That is what we see on screen. No, it is very screen accurate, which is to its credit. And to be fair, it actually has quite a nice texture to it all in all. It's a fairly thin cotton material, but it has several folds and flaps which make it a lot more interesting and fun. And she does have this interesting utility belt with various bits of pieces attached to it and bits of string coming down, which is kind of fun. You'll also notice on her wrist she has this extra piece, this wristband, which is quite colourful and again is a nice bit of attention to detail, which I think is a nice touch. The articulation scheme is identical for every figure in this wave, so I will just run through it the once today. She has a bolt joint in the head, or the neck, meaning that she can rotate her head from side to side, forwards and backwards, and side to side. She has ball joints in the shoulders, so the arms can kick up and out, which is great. There is an upper bicep swivel as well. There's double jointed elbows, and there is a pin swivel at the wrist, meaning that the hand can rotate 360 degrees, but also hinge forwards and backwards as well. Now, there is further articulation in the waist, meaning she can spin from side to side, she can lean forwards and backwards, and again lean from side to side as well, which is pretty fantastic stuff. She's got hinged hips, so the legs do kick out to the side. There's upper thigh swivel as well, and of course the legs kick forwards and backwards all the way. And there is a double joint at the knee, meaning those lower legs can kick all the way to the back there. And then finally there is a pin swivel at the ankle as well, meaning the foot can hinge forwards and backwards, but also swivel from side to side. She also comes with one accessory, which is her machine gun, which is very nicely sculpted. It actually has this fairly generous bit of rope attached to it, so it can strap over her shoulder. It looks pretty nice. There's actually a nice buckle in there as well, and it looks pretty fun. It looks pretty faithful to what we see on screen. It's nicely sculpted. There's not a lot of paint application to it, a lot more detail beyond that, but nevertheless, it does the job, and I think it looks pretty cool. And for a character I'm not wild about, I have to say, I think the figure is absolutely brilliant. Next up then, we have the Ood, probably one of the more memorable standout monsters from this time. The packaging design, as we can see, is pretty consistent with what we've already seen on the other figures in this line. But the interior inlay is unique because it is, of course, that diving bell that we see in the Satan Pit. There's no real surprises with this figure. It's pretty much exactly as you would imagine. It's pretty faithful to what we see on screen. The costume is a little dull, but that's not the figure's fault and certainly not character options' fault for perfectly recreating what we see on screen. It's definitely a plus point. Once more, we see the likeness is very sharp. They've done a really nice job of this sculpt. If I was being critical, I might say the eyes just look a little too narrow. They're not quite wide enough, but that is a very minor gripe. All in all, I think this is pretty faithful to what we see on screen, and that looks really good. Obviously, they have opted for the red eye, the possessed Ood, so it's definitely in full-on monster antagonist mode. But one of the unique features of this figure that I really like is the globe that they hold. Their translator, I think, is absolutely awesome because it is a single plastic piece, but when you pull it out, you will see that there actually is a magnet inside that attracts it back to the hand. So you can pull it away just about, and it will attract itself back into its grip. I think that's a really cool touch. It means that it stays in its grip nice and solid all the time, but it just adds that extra little bit of fun as well. He has brand new rubber shoes. These are ones that we haven't seen on any other figure, and I think pretty much every figure in this line actually had unique shoes. All things considered, this is a pretty cool addition to the line. Certainly the Ood is one of the most memorable monsters of New Who, certainly in these early series. I think it's a really nice addition. You're definitely going to want this figure in the collection. I do really like that Ood sphere, that translator that they have. I love the magnet in it. I think that's really inventive and very, very well done on Character Options' part. As I said, the sculpting is pretty excellent, and what we see in the costume is very faithful to what we see on screen. That said, there is something slightly dull about the figure once it's out of the packaging. I think the idea of the toy is probably more appealing than the actual toy itself. That said, that's certainly not a criticism of Character Options, because I think they've faithfully recreated the character as we see on screen. I just think the on-screen character itself is just in a little bit too dull a costume to be very fun as a toy. Finally, we have the Clockwork Man, and I think the Character Options were quite brave taking on this challenge, because this is quite a complex costume and character all in all. Once again, in terms of the packaging, it is pretty consistent with what we've already seen. Interestingly, on the back of the box, they actually have a different Clockwork Man to the one that's in the packaging, but hey, who's quibbling? The interior inlay is once again unique to this figure and is a nice touch. I think it's really nice when they do this. Obviously it has the fireplace there because of course it is from the episode The Girl in the Fireplace. Now, for sheer looks and presentation, I have to say I think this is probably one of the best figures in the entire line, because it looks really regal and rich and very, very attentive to detail, which is lovely to see for the 12-inch line. And as I said, I think it stands head and shoulders above many of the entries in this wave. The head sculpting is very nicely produced. We see a lot of detail on the hair, we see a lot of paint apps here in the face and in the hair wash itself, just giving it a bit more texture and depth, which I think is lovely. The gold paint around the eyes of that mask there, and it's a very faithful look to what we see on screen. Now, I know I'm using a slightly different version of this character in the TV show than on the actual figure, but you get the general impression. This is pretty faithful to what we see on screen, which is wonderful. There's certainly something very creepy about that expression on the face, that smile there. I think they've done a really very nice job of evoking that spirit. And if we look at the side again, the side profile, we have all this wonderful texturing and detailing in that hairline, and I just think they've done a really nice job with this. But the best part of the head sculpt is the fact that the head comes away and underneath we have the clockwork head, which I think is just a wonderful touch, very imaginative and very, very well done. As we can see all the individual gears and cogs inside that sort of clear dome, I think it's absolutely magnificent. They attempted to do this, and B, they pulled it off so well. I think this is an absolutely fantastic touch and a wonderful addition to the line. Now, the costuming is very, very elaborate. It's very faithful to what we see on screen. There's lots of colours and lots of details on here. I particularly like the trim and the cravat. Looks very, very nice. But you'll notice that the material itself, its texture is actually quite cheap and thin. And when you pull it apart, of course, you can see there's not a lot of extra detail going on underneath. As you can see the bare skin of the action figure, which is a little bit disappointing. But in terms of the visual aesthetic, it looks absolutely phenomenal. Again, the rubber shoes are a unique piece for this figure. It's very nice that they've actually bothered to paint in the buckle as well. I think that's a really nice touch, and I think it's really nice how they just generally got the presentation of this figure with the stockings and everything else perfectly in proportion and very screen accurate. The Clockwork Man also has unique hands, as we can see that ring hand there is a nice flat hand. I think that's very nicely done, but he also comes with an extra piece and accessory. He has that blade, that clockwork blade, which, as you can see, there is a slit on his wrist there, on the back of his hand I should say, on his fist, which just slides into place and holds very snugly and looks really good. So I have to say, all in all, I really like this figure. For me, he's one of the highlights of the entire collection. I think his presentation and his aesthetic is absolutely fantastic. I could not fault it. I love that he has that clockwork head underneath as well. That is the pièce de résistance. That is absolutely wonderful. The only criticism I have of this figure is that they've cheaped out a little bit in terms of the material that they use for the costume itself. So it's a little bit thin, it's a little bit rough to the touch, it's not very nicely textured. And so there you have it. There are 3 of the big monsters that we see in Series 2 of the new series of Doctor Who. I think there's some interesting choices here. Certainly the Clockwork Man and the Ood are obvious standouts for candidates that you'd want to use in a 12-inch line. Novice Haim, not so much, but that said, an excellent figure. And to be honest, all in all, these are all wonderful figures. I think there's a really inventive approach to some of the challenges these characters produce, which I think they've more than met. They've done a really wonderful job with these. I think the overall presentation and look and aesthetic for these figures is remarkably screen accurate, and all in all, I can't see how any fan would really want to be without them if you are into the 12-inch or the 1/6 scale line, because they do such a wonderful job with them. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.